So, can anybody remind us, what did we talk about last time? Which figure did we discuss? Which ideas did we look at? Descartes, right. What did Descartes have to say? Anything you can remember?
Something about senses versus the other one.
Yeah. He talked about the senses. He talked about the mind a lot, right? How he ended up equating, in some sense, what it means to be a human person with having a mind, with thinking, perceiving, willing, conceiving, all these different things, right?
Sense versus reason.
Right, yeah. Sense versus reason. That's a good way of putting it. And why was Descartes talking about this? He was talking about this in relation to what?
Dualism, monoism?
That's kind of a separate issue.
Rationalism?
Yeah, so his position was rationalism, right? This was a theory about how we obtain knowledge of the universe around us, right? How do we know what we know? Well, Descartes put forth rationalism, which was a position that argued primarily the way that we obtain knowledge of the universe around us is through our minds. It's something that our minds are doing, right? And he provided this famous wax example to try to motivate that. He said, look, if you have a piece of wax and it has a certain taste, smell, shape, all this stuff, then you hold it up to a fire and it melts, all of the sensory qualities of it have changed. But we can still recognize that it's still the same piece of wax. So how could that be? Well, it must be then that we don't apprehend and understand reality through the senses. It's something that our mind is doing. Our mind can track the identity of objects, can pick out objects in the environment. Our mind is what gives us access, in some sense, to reality, that allows us to form knowledge of reality at all. Well, today we're looking at a thinker who's going to be on the other side of the fence of this debate. Descartes was a rationalist. He thought that we obtain knowledge of the world through our minds. Locke, John Locke, famous English philosopher, is going to be putting forth a different view. Empiricism. This is what we're going to be talking about today, which is a different theory of epistemology. That is, how we obtain knowledge of the universe around us. But before we get into the specifics of his view, I thought it would be useful to give you some helpful distinctions and some terminology, because this is going to help us frame our understanding of these concepts moving forward. What these thinkers are engaged in, primarily, all the thinkers that we're looking at in this first unit, they are giving us descriptive analyses. In philosophy, there are two different analyses that you can provide of things. A descriptive analysis and a prescriptive analysis. Does anybody know what the difference is between these things? What does descriptive sound like? Describe, right. So what is a description? It's kind of a weird word, right? It's a word we use all the time, a description of something. What is a description? Yeah.
An explanation to what something is.
Exactly. It's like an explanation of what is, right? When you hear this word, I want you to think, what is? Descartes, Locke, other thinkers that are trying to answer the problems of metaphysics or epistemology, or who are analyzing the way society works or whatever it is, if they're providing you with a description or an explanation, they're engaged in descriptive analysis. They're trying to tell you the way that the world is. They're describing the way the world is to you, right? This chalk is white. That's a descriptive analysis. I'm wearing a pink shirt. That's a descriptive analysis. So all the thinkers we're looking at in this unit, they're doing this. They're trying to describe how they think the world works. As we move forward in the class, however, we're going to be looking at other kinds of analyses as well, especially in the second and third units, when we get into ethics and when we get into social and political theory. Those kinds of analyses are going to be prescriptive. What does this word remind you of? Does anybody take any medications here? What does this word remind you of?
Prescription.
A prescription. What is a prescription?
Something prescribed to you.
Something prescribed to you, right? Yeah. What does it mean for something to be prescribed to you? Yeah. Given to you, right? A prescription is basically a doctor writing a note telling you, you should take this, right? You should consume this or do this thing, whatever it is. A prescription is something that is given to you that tells you what you should do or what ought to be. As we move forward into the second unit, when we're talking about different theories about what makes an action moral or immoral, these thinkers are going to be concerned with telling us the way that we should behave, the ways that we should think, the things that we should do. They're going to be engaged in prescriptive analysis a lot. When you tell your friend, you shouldn't sleep with him, Jenny, he's not a good guy, you're giving your friend a prescription, right? Whereas when you just say, he's a liar, that would be a description, right? A descriptive analysis. So, keep these in the back of your mind. Keep this distinction in the back of your mind because we're going to be using it moving forward. Another one that we're going to use, and we're going to be talking a lot about today, is the distinction between a priori and a posteriori. These are some famous Latin phrases that philosophers like to use a lot, and they sound complicated, but they're not. And this distinction has a lot to do with this debate between how we obtain knowledge of the universe around us. Does anybody know what a priori means? Have you ever heard of this? Well, what word do you see in there?
Priori.
Close.
Prior.
Yeah, prior, right? What Descartes is doing a lot in his works is he's trying to describe to us the nature of the mind and the nature of knowledge prior to having any experience out there in the world. This is what a priori means. Prior to experience. It is a way of thinking about the world, of thinking about problems, just analytically, logically, right? You don't need to have any experiences out there in the world to know that 3 is bigger than 2, right? You can just logic your way to that conclusion, right? Or, for example, that the sun is not on Earth. You don't need to have experienced the sun to figure that out if you just know certain facts about our solar system, right? You can just logic your way to it. This debate about how we obtain knowledge has a lot to do with the distinction between a priori and a posteriori. If a priori means prior to experience, what do you think this means? Give me a guess.
After experience.
Right, exactly, after experience. See, when Descartes is making the claim that we obtain knowledge of the world around us using our minds, using our reason, our logical faculties, he's making a claim about the kind of knowledge that we have. It's knowledge that is given to us a priori. The primary way that we obtain knowledge of the world is after some sort of logical process has occurred that our mind has done on the world. As we'll see, Locke today is going to take the opposite view. He's going to say, no, the vast majority of the knowledge that we have, in fact, the primary way we obtain knowledge of the world around us is through experience. So all of our knowledge of the world comes after experience, a posteriori. This is going to be the central debate between the empiricists and the rationalists. What kind of knowledge do we have? Is the majority of our knowledge a posteriori or a priori? And which one of these should matter? What kind of knowledge should we rely on moving forward as a firm foundation? What kind of knowledge should we base our societies around, our sciences around, our other modes of inquiry? Should we rely on knowledge that we can just logic our way to more? Or should we rely on logic that comes from experience more? Okay. Are these distinctions clear to you between these things? Okay. I think it's going to be useful to frame our debate between the rationalists and the empiricists in this way. And this top one is just going to be useful talking about philosophy in general moving forward. Okay. Let's now jump into what Locke has to say in this piece. I asked you to read just an excerpt of his famous essay, aptly titled An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. What did you all get from this piece? What do you think Locke was talking about? What was he discussing? What was he trying to get at? Any ideas? Or are you like, I have no idea. I didn't even do the reading. What are you talking about? What was something that he discussed in the piece? Anybody remember?
He was kind of talking about the blank slate, or like talking so you don't know anything, and your norms and then your shapes, like as you get older.
Yeah. That he does talk about that. He offers a theory of where our ideas come from, and therefore kind of like what makes us who we are at the end of the day. Yeah. Yes.
Ideas are just perceptions and qualities how we describe the positive ideas. There's ideas and then qualities. He's talking about the difference between those two.
Right. What Locke is concerned with doing in this piece is talking about the nature of ideas. Descartes was focused a lot on describing our minds and how our minds work and how our minds interface with reality. Where Locke is going to kind of continue that analysis, but his focus is going to be on ideas. What are ideas? What are they like? Where do they come from? How do they impact human life? And so what Locke is going to be doing is he's going to be looking at these things, ideas that we have that we kind of take for granted. The things that allow us to do philosophy, to think about things, to imagine, conceive, conceptualize at all. He's basically talking about the stuff that the mind uses when it's engaging in philosophy or when it's trying to figure out the way that the world works. These are what he calls ideas. And it sounds confusing, but it's really not. What Locke is going to ultimately say is that we can't have knowledge without ideas. But we get ideas from a particular source. And this is where he's going to depart from Descartes. He is going to argue for the epistemological view of empiricism. Remember, rationalism says we obtain knowledge of the world around us primarily through reason, through our minds. Locke is going to say no, we primarily obtain knowledge of the world around us through our senses. That is where we get our ideas of the world from. It's through our sense organs, our eyes, our ears, our mouth, our sense of touch, our sense of smell. You know, we've said it before. So we don't primarily get our knowledge of the world through something our mind is doing, through some logical or analytical process. We get our knowledge of the world, we get our ideas about how the world works and what stuff is by sensing it, by seeing things, by hearing things, tasting things, right? That is how we obtain our ideas of the world. That is where our knowledge of the world comes from. Is through sense experience. Okay? Now, Locke is going to be talking a lot about ideas in this piece. It would probably be a good idea to define what he means by that. Because this is a very vague word, right? We talk about having an idea. We talk about stealing an idea. What the heck are we talking about when we say those things? And what is it exactly that we're getting from our senses? Because Locke thinks all our ideas come from our senses. Well, here's how he defines idea. Whatever is the object of the understanding when a person thinks. It sounds complicated, but I'll explain it to you. It's really not. A memory is an example of an idea. A concept. An image in your mind. These are all examples of ideas. An idea is just something that the mind uses to do mind stuff. So, close your eyes and picture a tree. All right, you picture a tree? That's an idea. Okay, if you got an image of a tree in your mind, that's an idea. Okay, you can open your eyes. Or your concept of what makes a chair, that's an idea. Or a memory that you have, that's an idea. It's basically just the stuff that your mind uses in order to think, imagine, replay things back in your head, consider. You could call it something like the currency of the mind or something. Our mind is filled with all these different ideas, and we can look at them and we can turn them around, and ideas can inform how we think and how we act and all this stuff. Make sense? It's a pretty general commonsensical thing. Well, Locke is going to end up saying that we get all of our ideas from experience, from what we see, smell, taste, hear, and touch in the world. Okay? He's working with a particular commonsensical view of the world here. Okay? Because what does this view, what has to be true in order for this view to be true? Empiricism. Well, it's something like this. There's us as beings that can experience the world, and then there are objects out there that exist outside of us, independently of us. Right? And those objects out there cause us to have certain ideas. That's the general picture that Locke is presuming here. Okay? And this is actually a picture that Descartes agrees with too, although he doesn't make it explicit in his writing. Okay? So he presumes that there are certain objects out there independent of us that exist with certain properties. Okay? Now, it seems strange to say this, to even make this explicit, but not everybody believes that this is the case, right? There are some people who think not only can you not prove the existence of there being an external world outside of your own mind, but all these things around us, they're not even what you think they are at the end of the day. They're just figments of your imagination, perhaps, or ideas in the mind of God, or something like that. But this is kind of the commonsensical view of the world that we have, right? This is certainly the view of the world that our sciences rely on, right? There are things out there outside of us that exist independently of us. If all humans were to disappear tonight, this table would still be here, right? And the table's existence does not depend on our existence, right? Or to take another example, this is Pierre. Pierre is like a cute little plague doctor plushie. This is my girlfriend. Pierre's pretty cool, right? If you were to die tonight, would Pierre still be around? Yeah, right? It's kind of how we think things work in our universe. Yeah, I agree. Pierre would still be around. This is the picture that Locke is working with. Okay, it's a picture that you work with every day in your lives, even though you don't have to explain it to yourself, right? And nobody has to explain it to you. So this is the view of the world that Locke has. There's us as perceiving creatures that exist. We have our own mental life, our own wishes and dreams. And then there's the whole world outside of us that is populated with objects and other people that are independent of us, that exist independently of us, like Pierre, and like name tags, and like pencils and rings and blinds. Okay? Pierre will come back up, so I'm going to leave him right here. The objects out there in the world cause us to have certain ideas. This is one of the things that Locke is going to say. And Descartes agrees with this picture too. If you were to read the rest of the Meditations, we see Descartes building his knowledge back up, and he agrees, yes, I do have a body. Yes, I do think there are objects out there outside of my own mind. He even puts forth an argument for the existence of God. But Locke is going to disagree with Descartes on a few major points, even though they both agree with this general picture. Okay? For one, because Locke thinks all of our ideas come from our experiences with the world, he's going to say there are no such things as innate ideas. Many rationalists think that we are just born with some ideas in our minds. Like, for example, ideas about the relationships between numbers. Or perhaps the idea of God is something that we're born with. Or the idea of what's right and what's wrong. Right? Maybe this is something that we're just born with. We don't have to be taught what's right and what's wrong. Locke doesn't agree with this. Okay? Locke thinks we get all of our ideas from our experiences in the world. So he denies the existence of innate ideas, ideas that we are born with. Whereas Descartes thinks, and a lot of other rationalists think, there are some ideas that we have of the world that we're just born with, that come pre-programmed into our minds. We don't have to have any experiences out there in the world for these ideas. We just come with them pre-programmed. Another thing that Locke is going to argue in this piece, and I've been saying this time and time again, which is related to this point, is he's going to say all of our ideas come from what he calls sensation and reflection. So we're not born with our ideas of the world. We have to get those through our experiences with the world. Locke thinks that we can come up with new ideas about the world by reflecting on things, by thinking things through, but they're already based on the fundamental building blocks that we get from experience. We can't come up with something entirely new. All we can do is use what we've gotten from experience to make new ideas. Like, for example, you can't imagine, Locke is going to say, a creature that is completely new and original. You can imagine a creature that has eagle claws and a lion's head and a human torso. But that creature that you've just imagined that's new is based on stuff that you've already seen or heard about, right? A human torso, eagle's claws, whatever it is. So we can come up with new ideas through reflection, but it's based primarily on the stuff that we get from experience if you dig down into it. Another thing that he's going to argue in this piece is the tabula rasa view of humanity. Does anybody know what this Latin phrase means? Somebody said it earlier.
It means
Mary? Blank slate, right. It's a Latin phrase that means blank slate. See, back in the day, when you had little Roman school children, going to their classes, they would take notes and they would do problems on these boards that were covered in wax. And they would have like a stylus that they would use to carve into the wax to do things. Well, when their board got all filled up with stuff, they would take a heat source and they would melt the wax and they would smooth it back over. So now they had another smooth surface to write on. That's where this phrase comes from, blank slate, tabula rasa. And this view basically argues that humans are born as blank slates. They don't have any ideas of the world pre-programmed into them. They get all of their ideas from their experiences, from their education, from what the church and society and their parents teach them. So Locke is going to argue in this piece that all humans are blank slates, at least in terms of the ideas that we have of the world. which is why education is so important. You can kind of mold people into having whatever ideas you want, so you got to give them the right ideas. You got to give them the right views. Finally, and this is kind of an overarching point I want to make that's important. It's not a view that you're going to see in a lot of the philosophers that we're going to have looking forward, except for a few of them that are a little humble. What philosophers are trying to do in their works is they're trying to get to the bottom of things, right? They're really trying to understand exactly what the fundamental nature of things is and how they work and how they're connected. Okay? But there's a problem. And this was a problem that Descartes brought forth in his writings. There is a difference between reality and appearance, right? It appears to you right now that we are sitting in this room, that we're having a conversation, that I'm lecturing, right? But how do we know that that's true, right? How do we know you're not in your bed right now, you're not having a dream, or you're not in a simulation? Maybe none of this is real, right? This was something Descartes was wrestling with, right, and struggling with in his piece. He was like, oh, shoot, it seems like I can doubt everything, right? Even things that seem obvious to me. Immanuel Kant, in his writings, is famous for making a distinction between what he calls the phenomenal world, what is given to us in experience, what appears to us, and the noumenal world, things as they are in themselves, what they are objectively, which exist behind the appearances that we're trying to get to. Kant ends up making the conclusion that we can't actually know what things are like in themselves. All we have access to are the appearances, which is kind of scary if you think about it, because that means we can't have like total and complete objective knowledge or certainty about what there is, because all we have access to is what our mind allows us to see, our perceptions. Well, although Locke doesn't say this explicitly, he ends up taking kind of a humble view with regards to this whole problem of, oh gosh, what do we do about this reality versus appearance distinction? Right? Oh my God, can we actually understand reality? Locke says, this is a problem you've just made up. Okay? At the end of the day, yes, we cannot know with certainty what lies beyond our experience, but that's okay. All we have access to is our experiences with the world, and we can base our society and our lives on that. That is enough. That's okay. Trying to figure out what the operations are behind the scenes, behind our perceptions, right? Is this really a table? Is it? He's like, it's a waste of time. It's okay. Just rely on your experiences. You don't have to think very deeply about what could be behind it all. Okay? This is his good empiricist disposition coming forward. Okay? He is not going to be so preoccupied with figuring out the way things are objectively behind our experiences and our perceptions the way that Descartes is. Okay? Instead, he's going to say, like, look, all we have access to is our sense experience and our perceptions at the end of the day. Our knowledge is bound up with our experience of the world. But that's okay. We don't have to freak out. Okay? So this is some of the general claims that Locke is going to be arguing for in this piece. These are some of the main ideas that we can pull from the first two chapters of this essay. And so let me ask you, does some of this seem reasonable to you? Do you think it makes sense? Like, for example, this common sensical picture of reality, right? There's us, and then there's a whole world of objects that exist outside of us. That causes us to feel certain ways and causes us to have certain ideas. Does that make sense to you? Yeah? You think this little controller exists independently of you? If you were to die tonight, would this controller disappear? Doesn't seem like it, right? I don't know, maybe it would. Can you kind of follow what Locke is doing here? How he's thinking? The kind of ideas that he's putting forth? Y'all are dead today. Tired. Maybe I should make you do jumping jacks or something. No, I won't make you do that. Any questions so far? This is the general picture of what Locke is going for. We're going to start getting into the nitty-gritty now of his analysis of ideas. We're talking about these things called ideas. We have ideas. What are they like? Do they come in different forms? He's going to say, yeah, they come in different forms. They have these different kind of properties. Let me tell you about them. Let's talk about chapters 3 through 8 in this piece now, where Locke tries to lay out for us an analysis of ideas, where they come from, what they are like, how we can know what objects outside of us are like, based on the ideas that we have, and the ideas that are given to us through sense experience, as opposed to just trying to logic your way through life, think about things a priori. Locke argues that there are two different kinds of ideas that humans have. Does anybody remember what they are from the reading? He talks about a lot of things, I know. It might be hard to summon that up from memory. So really, he breaks it down really easily and uses common sense words. There are simple ideas, and then there are complex ideas. Locke is not trying to confuse us here. Simple ideas are ideas that are made up of or concern one aspect of a thing. For example, Imagine blue in your head. Just close your eyes and imagine blue. Just imagine a field of blue in front of your vision. That's a simple idea. It's an idea concerned with one aspect of a thing, color. When you imagine a color, that's a simple idea because there's not other things entering into your mind's eye. Right? So color would be an example of a simple idea. Or whether or not something is moving or not is a simple idea. Either it's in motion or it's not in motion. Or whether something is hard or soft. That's a simple idea. Because other properties, other factors aren't added into that perception that you're having of hardness or softness. Okay? What a simple idea is will become a little bit more clear when we talk about a complex idea here in a second. Or what the temperature of something is. Whether it feels hot or cold to you. That's a simple idea. Why? Because if you're just thinking about the temperature of something, you're not thinking about anything else. Right? Contained in the idea of a thing's temperature is no other property of that thing. Bless you, by the way. Simple ideas cannot be created or destroyed, Locke says. We get them from our experiences with the world. That's how they get into us, get into our minds, but we cannot create or destroy them. You cannot create a new color in your mind, and you cannot destroy the ideas of color that you have. Like you can't just will yourself to destroy an idea you have of blue, right? Maybe somebody could do something to your brain, right, neurologically, but that's not what Locke is talking about here. So our minds are populated with these simple ideas that we have gotten from the world through sense experience. Like color, temperature, hardness or softness, motion. But our minds are also filled up with complex ideas. If simple ideas are ideas made up of or concerning one aspect of a thing, what do you think complex ideas are?
Two or more.
Exactly, more than one, right? They're ideas made up of or concerning multiple aspects or properties of a thing. For example, a blue ball. That would be a complex idea. Why? You're combining the simple idea of blueness and the simple idea of sphericalness of that shape into one thing. When you imagine a blue ball, that's made up of multiple simple ideas there. Or a red fire truck. Or a hard mattress. Right? Because when you imagine a hard mattress or when you see a hard mattress, you see the shape, you see the color. If you feel it, you feel, is it plush? Is it soft? Is it hard? All these different things wrapped up into one idea. Right? One complex idea. We could say complex ideas are made up of a bunch of simple ideas. So when I explain to you what a complex idea is, does that kind of make it easier to understand what a simple idea is? Most of what we think about or talk about in our daily lives are complex ideas, right? We don't sit around talking about blueness or sphericalness, right? No, we talk about capitalism, or we talk about laptops, or we talk about, cheating. These are all complex ideas, right? There's a lot baked into them. We have built them up in our minds using a lot of sensory data and experience. Okay? So this is how he breaks down the different kinds of ideas that we have. These are what our minds are filled with. They're filled with various simple and complex ideas, and we use these ideas to communicate, to make sense of the world, to reflect on our own experience, etc. Does this distinction make sense? I'll use an example. What color is Pierre's hat? Black. If you're just looking at the hat, the color of the hat, and you close your eyes and now you imagine the color of the hat, that's a simple idea. Okay, open your eyes again. Now when you look at Pierre, Pierre's whole body, his whole shape, everything. Okay, now close your eyes and imagine Pierre in your heads. That idea is a complex idea. Okay? Because it's composed of blackness. It's composed of whatever shape you would call this. Pierre shapeness. It's composed of, if I happen to have this plushie, I know that this is a glow in the dark. This little lantern thing, right? That's cool. All of those ideas bound up together in your image of Pierre, when you imagine Pierre in your head, that's a complex idea. As opposed to just his color, or whether or not he's in motion, or whether or not he's soft, or hot or cold, whatever it is, right? Make sense? Does anybody want to hold Pierre? Yes? No? No? He's so cool. Look at him. Honestly, he just sits around. Doesn't do much. So these are the ideas that we have that in our minds, that populate our minds. Okay? But they get in there through various ways. Okay? We've said before, yes, all ideas, according to Locke, we get through experience, but there are a lot of different ways of experiencing the world, right?
When you said picturing stuff before, I actually know there's a family member of mine that has aphantasia.
Right.
Actually, the inability to mentally picture something in your mind. I mean, they know what stuff is. They know what a blue ball is, but if you told them to close your eyes and picture it in their head, they would not be able to.
Right. And that's a pretty rare thing, right? At least according to what we know right now psychologically. But what's interesting is even if they can't imagine things, they can't picture things, they still have ideas about things, right? Otherwise, how would they be able to drive a car? They would have to know how a car works, right? So they have some sort of implicit idea or understanding. Or how would they know, how to go up an elevator? Or how to act in a mall, So they still have ideas, although they can't form images. Does that make sense? Yes. And what is that like for you? How else would you know about what other people's inner experience is like unless you talk to them, right?
Everyone just I don't know, I feel the concept in my body, in my chest.
Right.
I feel the concept of a blue ball, or I feel the concept of a tree, but I don't see them. So when people were oh, I see one, it's what do you mean you see one? Because to me, I see, right, feel.
Yeah.
Whenever I close my eyes or whatever, but other people are no, I see a tree. I don't know what you mean by that.
You understand it.
Yeah.
Right? And it's
Understand what you're saying. I know what a tree is, but I can't see when I close my eyes.
right.
And I don't know. People who can do that freak me out. What
They freak you out.
It's weird. I don't think I feel like I know what else
Well, I don't know. I don't have a particular strong ability to form mental images. I can if I try hard. But my brain works in concepts and words, not so much images. So I can kind of empathize. In any case, ideas come into our minds in different ways because there are different ways of experiencing the world, right? What are different ways of experiencing the world? How could you get the idea of a table? How could you acquire an idea of a table? What do you think? If you didn't know what a table was, how could you figure out what a table was? Or get an idea of what a table was in your mind? Jade?
You see a table and someone tells you it's a table?
Right, you could just look, right? You could use your sense of sight. Or you could use your sense of, feeling. Like, oh, that's what a table is. It's like a hard thing with this kind of smooth surface, right? Or you could bang it around and you're like, oh, okay, so that's kind of what a table does. It's, makes that kind of sound, right? So we can get an idea of something by using one of our senses. For example, this is how we get the ideas that we have of colors, right? Through our sense of sight. We're using one of our senses to acquire the idea of what blue is like, or what pink is like, or what red is like, right? Or to see whether or not something is in motion, right? All we use to see if something is in motion or not, to acquire that idea, is to use our sense of sight, right? Or what the temperature is of something, right? The only sense that we're using to figure out the temperature of something is our sense of touch, right? We don't need to activate our sense of smell or sight or hearing or any of that to know if something is hot or cold. So we can acquire ideas through one sense. Where do you think I'm going with this? How else can we acquire ideas? By using multiple senses, right? Of course. Can someone give me an example of that? Let's see how well your psychological and biological knowledge is. When you got that giant Chipotle burrito in front of you, and you're like, oh, this is going to be so good, and you just, bite into it, you're activating two senses there with your sense of taste. The way cilantro tastes to you, or the way the new, the new pineapple chicken or whatever tastes to you, is you're utilizing your sense of taste and your sense of smell to do that. So really, when you're tasting things, you're activating two senses, right? So how a Chipotle burrito tastes, you're using two senses to form that idea in your mind, right? Or the example that Locke talks about is extension. This is something that these modern philosophers, writing in the 16th to the 18th century, talk about, is extension. They talk about objects having extension. That just means it takes up space. It has volume. Well, how would you know an object has volume unless you're using your sense of sight and your sense of touch? Right? Because when we look at something, what we're basically seeing is like a 2D projection onto our retina, right? We wouldn't know that something actually has extension unless we saw it and we had experienced touching it. So we wouldn't know that this table is actually extended in space unless we had both seen it and we were like, okay, yeah, I can't squeeze through it. I know it has volume to it. So extension is something that we need two senses, multiple senses, in order to get that idea into our heads, that something is extended. But we can also form ideas through reflection. That is, we can form new ideas in our minds by taking what we've gained through experience and mashing them together, combining them in different ways, kind of like Legos, right? Say you're trying to write a new story. Well, you've watched Beauty and the Beast, you've read Pride and Prejudice, you've watched The Wire or Breaking Bad or whatever it is, and you're trying to write a new story, so you bring in all these elements from these different stories and you combine them into your own story. After thinking through your plot and how you want your characters to be. That idea you have of your new story, you got through reflection, right? Through thinking about it, by combining all these other ideas you had into its own novel thing. Does that make sense? Or for example, let's say you're working with your therapist and you're trying to figure out, why can't I accept a compliment from my significant other? Does it have to do with the trauma response that I have or something like that? And you experience a breakthrough with your therapist. That came about through reflection. Your new idea that you have of yourself and your relationship to compliments, you got through reflection, right? So we might say, those kinds of things we get through reflection, or logical deductions we get through reflection, right? Because we're using our minds to put a problem to ourselves, and we're looking at it from different angles, and we're coming up with new knowledge. Finally, we can also get ideas through a combination of sensation, and reflection. And Locke's examples for ideas that are formed in this way are a little weird, but I'll try to explain it. He talks about things like power, the idea of power, and the idea of unity. You have a certain idea of what power is in your minds. That idea is probably based on experiences that you've had in the world and you reflecting on what your professors or teachers have told you about power in your social justice classes or something. Right? So that would be an example of an idea that you have that is formed from sensation and reflection. Or he talks about unity. For example, what do I have in my hand? Chalk. This is a group of chalk, right? Even though there are multiple chalk pieces here, we could say in some sense this is a unit. It's one group of chalk. As opposed to if there was another group of chalk right there, I'd say this is a group and this is a different group, right? This would be an example of like a unity. You need sensation, you need to be able to see the distinct elements of the group or the pile or whatever it is, experience it, but also it's also one thing in a sense, right? Just by thinking about it and by linking up the concepts of what makes one thing and another thing. Kind of a weird example, but in any case, it's the example that Locke uses. Now, we get different ideas into our minds in these different ways, but the kinds of ideas that we have of things, Locke is going to say, depend on multiple factors. First of all, the ideas that you have of things depend on how your mind works and how your senses work. But also, Locke is going to make the commonsensical claim that one of the factors that determines the kinds of ideas that you have is what objects are actually like out there. The objective properties of objects. So then, in his analysis, he begins talking about qualities. He says, objects have what are called qualities. A quality is the power of a thing to produce an idea in the mind. And here's what he has to say about qualities. This is on page 30 in the reading on the left side. Section 7 in this chapter. To reveal the nature of our ideas better and to talk about them intelligibly, it will be convenient to distinguish them as they are ideas in our minds and as they are states of matter in the bodies that cause such perceptions in us. Most ideas of sensation are no more like a thing existing outside of us than the names that stand for them are like the ideas themselves. But no matter. Whatever the mind perceives in itself, whatever is the immediate object of perception, thought, or understanding, I call an idea. And the power to produce an idea in our mind, I call a quality of a thing that has that power. Thus, a snowball having the power to produce in us the ideas of white, cold, round, the powers to produce those ideas in us as they are in the snowball, I call qualities. And as they are sensations or perceptions in the mind, I call ideas. Qualities, thus considered in bodies of things out there in the world, are of two kinds. First, there are those that are utterly separable from the body, what he's going to call primary qualities. And then there are those that are not part of the objects themselves, which he's going to call secondary qualities. So, Locke is working with this picture that there are objects that exist outside of us that cause us to have certain ideas. Some of those ideas are based on the way the object is objectively out there in the world. That is, it is based on the primary qualities the object has. Primary qualities are qualities inherent in the object itself. What are some features or properties of objects that are inherent in the objects themselves? What do you think? Is there any property or quality you can think of that doesn't depend on our perception, that is just a part of the object itself? Let's take a weird example. How about extension? The fact that an object has volume, does that depend on your existence at all? No, it just has volume. It's just a property of the object itself. So extension would be an example of a primary quality. It's just part of the object, right? The volume that this table has is just part of the table. It doesn't depend on me or you or anybody else to see it, that it has that volume, right? Or how about the fact that there's only one table here? The number of the table. There's one table here, right? Not multiple tables right here. If we all disappeared tonight, how many tables would be right here? One, right? So how many of a thing there are doesn't depend on human perception, Locke says. The number of tables right here is just dependent on how many frickin' tables there are right here, the object in itself, okay? So number would be an example of a primary quality. What shape is this notepad? It's a rectangle, right? What shape would this notepad be if we all died right now?
Rectangle.
It would still be a rectangle, you think? It wouldn't change shape? Locke agrees. He would say the shape of something too is a part of the object itself. It doesn't depend on human perception. How about whether or not an object is moving? Let's imagine we shot something into space. And it's sailing through space, it's going. All of a sudden we kill ourselves in a nuclear war. Is that object in space still moving? Yes or no?
Yes.
So the fact that it is in motion or not in motion doesn't depend on us. Locke agrees. He would say motion is also something that is inherent to the object itself. It doesn't depend on us at all. Finally, one other example he gives is what he calls solidity. The fact that an object has a property that something can't pass through it. Right? This table has solidity. My hand can't pass through it. Right? My hand meets resistance when I punch it. Whether an object has solidity or not, Locke thinks, it has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with the properties of the object itself. So all of these things, Locke thinks, are part of objects themselves, regardless of what we think or believe or hope or dream or wish. Okay? These things are parts of objects themselves, and these properties of objects cause us to have certain ideas of them. The reason why we tend to see a particular shape when we look at the notepad is because it really has that shape. It having the rectangular shape makes us see it as rectangular, in a sense. This being motionless causes us to have the idea that it's motionless, because that's just the way it is, and we see that, we notice that. But not all qualities are like this, okay? Sometimes the idea that we have of an object is not a part of the object itself, right? For example, for anybody here, does cilantro taste like soap to them? Do you think the soapy taste is part of the cilantro itself?
No.
We don't generally think that, right? People have different tastes, right? Is the salty taste of pork part of the pork itself? Like, is the taste in there, like waiting to come out when we bite into it or something? Generally, we think no, right? So, objects out there in the world have what Locke calls secondary qualities that cause us to have certain ideas of them, but they're not part of the object itself. Okay? Can you think of any examples of secondary qualities? We just went over one, right? Taste. The way something tastes to you isn't a part of the object itself, right? Otherwise, we would all taste the same thing, right? When we had pork, or when we had chili, or when we had cilantro. Can you think of anything else?
Color?
Color, that's a great one. Why do you say color?
Well, because people see different colors in what's in other animals. They have different colors that they can see compared to us.
Right. Other species see the world differently. They see different colors. We know for a fact that there's a whole spectrum of colors that we can't see, right, due to our own eyes. Here's a weird science-y fact you can talk about with your friends. What color is my shirt?
Pink. Red.
Coral.
Coral. intense salmon. I don't know. Locke would say the pinkness of this shirt is not part of the shirt itself. And we would tend to agree with him. But let's try to think about this scientifically or objectively. What is color? Has anybody taken a physics class?
It's what light bounces off of something, and that's what you're seeing.
Right. The colors that we see of things are the reflections of light off those things. So when you look at the walls around you and you see like a beige, a creamy beige, that's light that is being reflected off of the wall into your eyes. Maybe scientifically it would be more appropriate to say the real color of these walls is everything that is not creamy beige. Right? Because you're only seeing the reflection of the light that is not being absorbed by the surface. It's kind of weird, right? In any case, Locke's point is colors. They're not a part of the objects themselves, like number or extension or shape is part of the object itself. We might also say sound. What something sounds like to you, right, is not part of the object itself. Some people listen to Beethoven, they think it's beautiful and amazing, and some people are like, this is trash, man. I just listen to Lil Yachty, you know? So what something sounds like to you is not part of the object itself, right? Locke thinks that by making this distinction clear, he's helped us understand why people have differences in perception, why we have different ideas about things in the world. Sure, there are things that we agree with regards to objects in the world, like this is a rectangle, like this is motionless, right? But there are a whole bunch of other things that we disagree with. If I were to play, Janis Joplin for you, some would like it, some would love it, some would hate it. We do have different perceptions, right? One of the reasons why we have different perceptions is because, well, our minds work differently. We have different tastes. We have different preferences. And how an object strikes us is not always the same. Or at least it's not the same in regard to these properties or qualities that objects have. Does that make sense? So Locke thinks this distinction explains to us why we have differences in perception. Bless you. And that is basically Locke's analysis of ideas. And he spends a long time going through all of this because, like a philosopher, well, he just kind of has a drive to understand the way the world works. He wants to make clear how our minds work so that scientists and philosophers moving forward can not have the same debate all the time, but actually progress in these different fields. And in part because he has a bone to pick with some of Descartes' ideas and his positions. You can see this piece being written in part as a response to what Descartes was arguing and what he stood for. And there are certain lessons that we too can pull from what Locke is saying here that will help us understand better what this debate between the rationalists and the empiricists really is about. Because it's about a few different things. So I'd like to make that explicit, okay? Because it's important. How you think we obtain knowledge of the world around us and what you think exists is going to have ramifications for what all your other beliefs are, right? obviously we have differences in how we think people should live, on what we think justice is, on what we think is moral or immoral. What lies at the bottom of all of those differences are differences in how we think we obtain knowledge, what we think counts as knowledge and evidence, and what we think exists. So that's why we're starting out in this unit by looking at metaphysics and epistemology first. Because if people have differences in metaphysics and epistemology, they're going to have differences in ethics, in social and political theory, in philosophies of life. It's just going to multiply and multiply and multiply. Okay? So I hope that I can give you some useful terminology and some useful frameworks to not only make sense of your beliefs and help you achieve a better understanding of the world around you, but that's so you can talk more intelligently with other people and see where the real differences lie. Make sense? Okay. So, to recap, we should do this. There we go. The rationalism versus empiricism debate is over three main things. Firstly, how we receive knowledge. Do we receive knowledge through our experiences or through logical thinking, through rational logical processes? Secondly, what forms of knowledge matter? Does our sense experience matter more than logical deductions, or vice versa? And finally, what forms of knowledge we should prioritize in understanding and acting within the world? And I'll bring out an example to help make this more clear. There are a lot of debates being had now between the two different sides of the political aisle, right? On the more left progressive side, you have people saying Western society is oppressive. It's hurting and harming all of these people. It's propagating social injustice, inequity. It's constraining people. And on the right side of the political aisle, you have people saying, don't be such a baby, right? United States society is pretty damn good compared to other parts of the world, right? You're not being oppressed. That's just something you've made up, right? You're over-exaggerating. We can talk about why these two sides believe the things that they do, okay? What you'll hear from the left side is that personal experience matters, right? Lived experience is what we should be talking about, right? How something strikes you really does matter. Whereas the right side is going to say lived experience doesn't matter that much, right? Let's look at things logically and objectively, right? So you can see how these kind of line up under rationalism and empiricism, right? You can see how these different political positions on philosophies of life, fall out of differences in epistemology and differences in metaphysics. Why is the right side of the political aisle, why do they tend to be religious? And why do they tend not to put an emphasis on material things or changing economic material circumstances? Because a lot of them are dualists. They think there's this whole other spiritual world that matters and is more important than the physical material world, than economics, than society. Whereas the people on the left side of the political aisle tend to be more materialists, or we should say physicalists. I don't mean to say they're materialistic, but they think, no, the economic, material, physical stuff, the concrete stuff, matters. And that's what we should be thinking about and changing, not wondering and worrying about all this spiritual stuff. You see what I'm saying? How these differences fall out of differences in metaphysics and epistemology? That's why we're looking at this stuff first. Is because I want you to get a clear understanding of what these different positions are, so you can make sense of your own beliefs, so you can talk to other people, and understand where the disagreements really are, and if compromise can be achieved. So to give you a helpful table, I'm going to break down a few of the primary disagreements between rationalism and empiricism. And this is something that you can study to help get all of this clear in your own minds, right? The rationalists and the empiricists disagree about the source of our knowledge. They disagree about what knowledge we should prefer and prioritize in science, society, inquiry. And they disagree about what forms of knowledge we should rely on, say to organize society, to determine social policy, how to live. Rationalists, for example, are going to say, where does our knowledge come from? Some of it is innate, and it primarily comes from reason, logically thinking through things. What about the empiricists? Where do they think knowledge comes from? Right. The senses, we can generalize and say experience. Again, to take another progressive example, they're going to say you can't logic your way to how oppression feels. Right? You need to have had experienced it to really understand its gravity. They also disagree again on what knowledge we should privilege and prioritize. The rationalists are going to say a priori knowledge is where it's at. Knowledge that is really firm and certain is knowledge that we can get at just through reasoning and logical deduction, because the senses can lead us astray, they're going to say. Experience is not a good way to move forward in the sciences necessarily, or philosophy, social and political theory. Whereas, what are the empiricists going to prefer? Not a priori. What's the other one? Yeah, it's hard to say, right? The way that I phrase it, I took Latin for a while. A posteriori. A posteriori. After experience. And thus, finally, what kind of knowledge we should rely on in developing science, mathematics, philosophy, social and political theory, social policy, law, all this stuff. The rationalists are going to say knowledge derived from reason is the knowledge that matters. And what are the empiricists going to say? Knowledge derived from what? Experience. There you go. That's the knowledge that matters, they think. Because there's a bunch of things that reason can't get us to. There are a bunch of things that we can only know if we experience them. And isn't experience what matters? Okay. So you clear on these differences and why this debate matters? Unless you yourself get clear on what your epistemological position is, on what your metaphysical position is, if you're having political debates with people, you're just going to be constantly talking past each other because you're not really getting to the root of the disagreement. Right? So what do you think of Descartes' view and Locke's view? Is there one that you are gravitating more towards, one that you like better?
Gravitating more towards Locke's view, personally.
Okay. Tell me about that. Why?
I'm more of someone who learns primarily from experience, someone who tries to improve their life. I might have a different perception of something before I've actually experienced it, but once I experience it, I might agree with my original perception, or my perception might change.
Yeah. So you can see the merits of Locke saying, look, in order to know some stuff, you got to experience it. Right? For example, how would you know whether or not you like tikka masala unless you've had it? Right? Or, for example, how do you know what if oppression exists or what it feels like unless you've been on the receiving end of it? Right? Does anybody like Descartes' view? I don't see anybody saying, yes, so let me play devil's advocate. When it comes to mathematics, when it comes to philosophy, should we privilege knowledge from experience, or should we think things through rationally first? The truth is there are some things that we can get at only through reason, because we can't experience it. For example, mathematical proofs. You can't experience why, the imaginary number I has to do with this mathematical operation, right? I doesn't exist in the world. The square root of -1 doesn't exist in the world, right? So for some things, you need logic and reason. In mathematics, for example. That's the only way you can push the field forward. Although inspiration might come from experience, right? So I would say, look, there's some merits to both. It doesn't have to be one or the other, totally. You can agree that experience is necessary for knowledge without saying experience is sufficient for knowledge. Right? Those two things are different. You could believe maybe that there are innate ideas, like the rationalists do. Anybody here think we are born with some ideas about how the world works, or no? If you're a Christian, you might. Because the Bible says that the law of God is written upon the hearts of man. That we are born knowing what is right and what's wrong. We don't need society to tell us that torturing an infant for fun is bad. Right? But I don't know. You'll have to search your beliefs and your feelings. What we're going to look at on Wednesday is somebody who is going to blow a lot of what Locke is saying here out of the water. Or at least he's going to try to. He's going to say, Locke, all these distinctions you're making are baseless and stupid, and I'm going to show you why. I'm going to show you why we shouldn't even believe in the existence of material objects that exist outside of us. I'm going to show you there's no way that we can even prove that such objects exist. That'll be a real conversation, like one you have after smoking a large bowl or something. Okay. That's all I got for you. Any questions, concerns? Okay. Thank you for coming. Make sure to sign the attendance thing before you leave. Otherwise, I will see you on Wednesday.